In Cedar Grove, where family farms fade into corporate fields, 38-year-old Thomas Mason has made peace with fixing other people's dreams while his own hang by a thread. His skilled hands have kept his small farm alive, earning extra income by restoring the broken pieces of his neighbors' lives. When Sarah Richards asks him to rebuild her weathered barn, it seems like just another job. But beneath the splintered boards and rusted nails lies a truth that neither expects to uncover. She's a billionaire in hiding, searching for something money can't buy. He's a craftsman who measures worth in honest work and genuine connections. As autumn paints the countryside gold, they'll discover that the strongest foundations aren't built with wealth, but with trust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung thick over Thomas Mason's kitchen window as he spread his ledger across the worn oak table, the same table where his father had done their farm's books for 30 years before him. Steam rose from his coffee mug, mingling with the pale light filtering through the curtains his mother had sewn just before she passed. The numbers hadn't gotten any better overnight. Thomas ran a calloused hand through his dark hair, squinting at the column of figures that seemed to mock his efforts. The bank loan payments were mounting, and the equipment repairs he'd been putting off couldn't wait much longer. His side business of carpentry and repairs had kept the wolves from the door so far, but barely. Just last week, the Hendersons' place down the road had sold to Midwest Agricultural Enterprises, another family farm swallowed up by corporate interests. The local paper lay folded beside his plate, its headline a stark reminder of the changing times. Cedar Grove farm sales hit record high. Thomas had stopped reading these articles months ago. They all told the same story. Family farms were becoming relics, and men like him were dinosaurs refusing to accept extinction. A knock at the door startled him from his brooding. Through the screen, he could make out a woman's silhouette against the morning light. She wasn't one of his usual customers. He knew most everyone in Cedar Grove, and this stranger's posture spoke of someone unused to farm country visits. "Mr. Mason." Her voice carried a hint of uncertainty, but no trace of the local accent. "I was told you might be able to help me with a restoration project." Thomas opened the door, wiping his hands on his jeans more out of habit than necessity. The woman before him was around his age, maybe a few years younger, dressed in what he supposed was casual wear, but looked too new, too carefully chosen to be truly casual. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup, but something about her seemed precise. "That's me," he said, managing a smile despite the ledger's numbers still weighing on his mind. "What can I help you with, Miss Richards?" Sarah Richards. She returned his smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I recently acquired the old Miller property on Route 7. The barn, well, it's seen better days. I'd like to restore it if possible." Thomas knew the place. The Miller barn had been a local landmark once, back when Cedar Grove still had landmarks worth mentioning. He'd watched it slowly deteriorate over the years, each passing season claiming another piece of its dignity. The property had sat empty. For so long he'd lost track. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, already reaching for his truck keys. Restorations can be tricky, might not be worth the investment depending on the damage. Something flickered across Sarah's face. Surprise, maybe, or approval. "I'd appreciate that. I'm staying in the farmhouse, so we can drive over whenever you're free." The drive was short, but telling. Sarah sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, studying the passing farmland with an intensity that suggested she was seeing more than just fields. At the Miller property, the barn's condition struck Thomas harder than he expected. The once proud structure sagged visibly, its weathered boards grey with age, patches of sky visible through holes in the roof. Inside was worse. Years of neglect had taken their toll. Water damage stained the upper beams, and the floor creaked ominously under their feet. But beneath the decay, Thomas could see the bones of something worth saving. hand-hewn beams of solid oak, joinery that had held for generations. "Well?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a note of concern he hadn't heard before. Thomas took his time answering, mentally cataloguing the work ahead. "It's not beyond saving," he said finally, "but it'll take time and it won't be cheap." Sarah nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "I want it done right, Mr. Mason, whatever that takes." She paused, then added, "I have faith in your reputation." Thomas found himself studying her again. There was something about the way she stood there, surrounded by decay but radiating determination, that made him want to say yes, despite the scope of work ahead. "I'll draw up an estimate," he heard himself say. "We can start as soon as you approve it." Sarah's smile this time reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Mason. I look forward to working with you." As he watched her walk back to her car, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just agreed to more than a simple barn restoration. But with his own farm's future hanging by a thread, he was in no position to turn down good work, even if it came with questions he couldn't quite answer. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made every color seem sharper, every shadow deeper. Thomas pulled up to the Miller barn, just as the sun was beginning to burn off the dew, his truck loaded with tools and his father's old carpentry belt secure around his waist. The leather was worn smooth from decades of use, each tool pocket shaped by memory and tradition. He paused at the barn's entrance, breathing in the familiar scent of aged wood and dusty hay. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Take your time with the first look, son. A rushed assessment leads to missed problems." It was the same advice he'd given 13-year-old Thomas when teaching him to repair their own barn's roof, guiding his hands over weathered shingles and explaining how to read the story written in worn wood. The barn's interior looked different in the morning light. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that pierced through gaps in the walls, creating shifting patterns on the dirt floor. Thomas began his systematic inspection, starting with the foundation and working his way up, making detailed notes in his worn leather notebook. "Good morning, Mr. Mason." Sarah's voice startled him from his concentration. She stood in the doorway, 2 thermoses in hand. "I thought you might want some coffee." Thomas accepted the thermos with a nod of thanks, noting how she seemed more at ease today in well-worn jeans and a faded work shirt. Still careful in her movements, but less constructed. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, watching as he tested a beam's strength. "Actually, yes," he gestured upward. "The main support beams are original, hand-hewn white oak. You don't see craftsmanship like this anymore. Each one was shaped with an adze. Probably took days to get right." His fingers traced the subtle tool marks. The man who built this knew what he was doing. Sarah stepped closer, her eyes following his gesture. "You can tell all that just by looking. My father taught me to read buildings like stories." Thomas moved to the ladder leading to the loft. "Mind if I check up there? Need to assess the roof damage from inside before I start any repairs." At Sarah's nod, he climbed carefully, testing each rung. The loft was thick with dust and scattered hay, but the floorboards felt solid under his feet. Light filtered through the gaps in the roof, illuminating years of accumulated farm life. In the far corner, something caught his eye. A wooden box, partially hidden under old burlap sacks. "Found something," he called down, carefully making his way over. The box was old but well made, its hinges surprisingly smooth when he opened it. Inside, protected from dust by the tight-fitting lid, lay a stack of photographs. The top image showed the barn in its prime, probably 40 years ago. The red paint was vibrant. The doors hung straight and true, and in front stood a family. 3 generations by the look of it, proud before their beautiful building. "Would you like to see these?" he asked Sarah, who'd been watching his exploration with evident curiosity. She climbed the ladder with surprising agility. Their shoulders nearly touched as they bent over the photographs together, and Thomas caught a subtle scent of lavender that seemed strangely fitting. "That's amazing," Sarah breathed, carefully lifting one photo. It showed the barn's interior during what appeared to be a harvest celebration. Lanterns glowing warmly, hay bales arranged as seating, people dancing on the smooth wooden floor. "It was more than just a building, wasn't it?" Thomas nodded, understanding. In his bones what she meant. Barns like this were the heart of a farm. Weddings, celebrations, community gatherings, they happened here as much as any church social. Could it be like that again? There was something in her voice, hope, maybe, or longing, that made him look at her more closely. In the filtered light of the loft, her carefully maintained composure seemed to soften. "It could," he said slowly, already seeing the possibilities. "The bones are here. It'd take work, but—" He paused, running his hand along a nearby beam. With the right care, this place could come alive again. Sarah's smile held a warmth he hadn't seen before. "Then let's bring it back to life, Mr. Mason." They spent the next hour going through the photos, Sarah asking questions about construction details that revealed a surprising knowledge of architecture, Thomas sharing stories his father had told him about similar barns he'd helped restore. When they finally descended from the loft, the morning's golden light had shifted to the clear brightness of midday. "I'll start with the roof," Thomas said, already mentally organizing the work ahead. "Need to stop any more water damage before winter sets in. Then we can work our way down, keeping what's sound, replacing what's not." Sarah nodded, her businesslike demeanor returning, but something had shifted between them. The photos had given them a shared vision, a purpose beyond simple repair. "Whatever you need," she said. "I trust your judgment." As Thomas watched her walk back to the farmhouse, he found himself wondering again about the woman who'd hire a small-time farmer to restore a piece of agricultural history. The photos weighed heavy in his pocket, reminding him that some things, like the stories held in these old walls, were worth more than money could measure. Thomas spent the next morning clearing debris from the barn's ground floor, working methodically from east to west. Each wheelbarrow of old hay and broken boards revealed another layer of the barn's history. He'd just begun tackling a particularly stubborn pile of weathered lumber when something metallic caught his eye. "Well, what do we have here?" he muttered, carefully shifting the boards aside. Beneath decades of dust and cobwebs lay what appeared to be old horse tack, but not the common kind. His hands moved reverently over brass fittings and supple, age-darkened leather. This was show equipment, the kind used for county fairs and professional exhibitions. "Find something interesting?" Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She'd taken to bringing him coffee mid-morning, though today she carried a tablet along with the thermoses. "Take a look at this." Thomas lifted the bridle, its brass catching the sunlight streaming through the barn's gaps. "This is exhibition-grade tack, probably from the 1940s. The craftsmanship is incredible. See these stitches? All done by hand." Sarah set down the coffee and moved closer, her fingers tracing the intricate leather work. "You know about this stuff? My grandfather was a horse trainer, used to restore pieces like these in his spare time." Thomas turned the bridle over, examining the maker's mark. "This is Holbrook work. They were the premium manufacturers back then. People still collect these pieces." "You sound like an expert," Sarah observed, and something in her tone made him look up. She was watching him with an intensity that seemed at odds with their casual conversation. "Just picked things up over the years," he said modestly, but couldn't help adding, "though I did restore a full set of Holbrook showtack for the Cedar Grove Historical Society last year. They got a nice price for it at auction." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Historical Society. I didn't realize they were active in preservation work." "They try." Thomas set the bridle aside carefully. "But funding's tight. Lot of history around here's being lost because nobody can afford to save it." He thought of the collection notices on his kitchen table. Farming's changed. The old ways, they're expensive to maintain. "Yet you maintain them," Sarah said quietly. She'd picked up another piece of tack, handling it with surprising familiarity. "Your farm. You still use traditional methods, don't you?" Thomas paused in his work, studying her. "How'd you know that?" "I did my research before coming here." She met his gaze steadily. "Your farm is one of the few in the county that hasn't converted to industrial methods. You rotate crops, maintain soil health naturally, keep livestock in traditional patterns." Her fingers worked at a stubborn buckle as she spoke. "It's not the easiest way." "No," Thomas agreed, wondering what else she knew about him. "But it's the right way. At least it is for that land. Been in my family 4 generations. Each one learned what the soil needs, what works best for those particular fields." He smiled slightly. "My father used to say we weren't just farming the land, we were farming time, building on what came before, preserving it for what comes after." Something flickered in Sarah's expression. "And now?" "Now?" Thomas picked up another piece of tack, a martingale with delicate silver accents. "Now the banks say efficiency is everything. That tradition is just another word for outdated." He shrugged, but couldn't quite hide the bitterness in his voice. "Hard to argue when their numbers are all in black and mine are all in red." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hands still working at the old buckle. When it finally gave way with a soft click, she looked almost triumphant. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the true value of things isn't obvious at first glance." Before Thomas could respond, she'd set down the piece she'd been cleaning and reached for her tablet. "Speaking of value, I wanted to show you something. I've been researching the barn's original construction. Look at this." She pulled up a series of architectural drawings, surprisingly detailed for their age. Thomas found himself drawn in, despite his lingering questions about her knowledge of his farm. The drawings showed the barn in its original glory, including several innovative design elements he hadn't yet discovered. "Where did you find these?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "County archives. They've been digitizing their historical records." She scrolled through several more images. The Miller barn was apparently quite famous in its day. It introduced several agricultural storage innovations that became standard in the region. Thomas nodded slowly, pieces clicking into place. "That's why you wanted to restore it. It's not just an old barn, it's agricultural history." "Among other reasons," Sarah said softly, and again he had the sense she was saying more than her words conveyed. "History matters, Mr. Mason, even when it's not profitable." They spent the next hour going through the drawings together, Sarah revealing a depth of architectural knowledge that both impressed and puzzled him. She spoke about load-bearing calculations and period-appropriate materials, with the ease of someone well-versed in restoration work, yet maintained that she was new to farming. As the afternoon light began to fade, Thomas gathered the rescued. "Tack into a careful pile. I'll clean these up properly," he offered. "Get them documented. Might be worth something to the right collector." Sarah smiled, that same warm expression that seemed to transform her careful composure. "They're already valuable," she said. "You saw that the moment you found them." Watching her walk back to the farmhouse, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been having 2 conversations all afternoon, one about old horse tack and architectural drawings, and another about something much more personal. He looked around the barn, at the treasures they'd uncovered, at the history waiting to be restored. "What exactly are you up to, Sarah Richards?" he murmured to the empty air. But the barn, keeper of so many secrets, offered no answers. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, their edges tinged with an ominous green that every farmer knew to respect. Thomas had been watching them build all morning while working on the barn's upper supports, trying to judge if he had time to finish. Securing the temporary patches on the roof before the storm hit, the wind picked up, carrying with it the electric smell of approaching rain. Inside the barn, he found Sarah already there, her hair whipping around her face as she struggled to close the massive double doors against the strengthening gusts. "Let me help with that," he called, hurrying down from his ladder. Together they managed to secure the doors just as the first heavy drops began to fall, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. "I found this in the house," Sarah said, slightly breathless, holding up a leather-bound book. Even in the dim light, Thomas could make out the gilt edges of what appeared to be a family Bible. It was hidden behind some shelving. "I thought it might be safer here with the other historical items we've found." A crack of thunder made them both jump, followed by the sudden intensity of rain hitting the roof in earnest. Through the gaps in the walls, Thomas could see sheets of water being driven sideways by the wind. "We should move everything away from the walls," he said, eyeing the collection of rescued artifacts they'd gathered over the past few days. "Some of these leaks are worse than I thought." They worked quickly in the strange stormlight, moving the clean tack, old tools, and photographs to the center of the barn where the roof was most solid. Sarah handled each item with careful reverence, particularly the Bible. "Look at this," she said, opening it gently once they'd finished. The family record pages were filled with neat handwriting, documenting births, deaths, and marriages dating back to 1887. The Millers kept such detailed records. Thomas peered over her shoulder, their heads close together as lightning illuminated the pages. "That's not just family history," he said, pointing to margin notes that caught his eye. "See these? They're recording crop rotations, weather patterns, livestock bloodlines, farming history, written right alongside family milestones." "As if they're one and the same," Sarah murmured, her finger tracing a line that noted both a birth and the first successful planting of a new wheat variety. Another thunderclap rattled the barn's frame, and Thomas instinctively placed a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder. She didn't pull away. "My family had a Bible like this," he said, watching rain track down one of the support beams. "Lost it in the flood of '98, along with most of our other records. Dad always said losing those pages was like losing part of our compass, all that. Gathered wisdom gone in one night." Sarah turned to look at him, their faces close in the dim light. "But you still have the knowledge," she said softly. "I've watched you work. Every decision you make about your farm comes from generations of understanding." "Fat lot of good it's doing me now," he said before he could stop himself. "Banks don't give loans based on inherited wisdom." Maybe they should. There was an edge to her voice he hadn't heard before. "Maybe we've lost something important by reducing everything to quarterly profits and efficiency metrics." The storm's fury began to ease, the thunder growing more distant. In the relative quiet, Thomas could hear water dripping through various leaks, creating a random melody on the barn floor. "Tell me about the flood," Sarah said suddenly. "The one that took your family Bible." Thomas was surprised to find himself wanting to share the story. "I was just starting to take over more of the farm management from Dad," he began, settling onto a sturdy crate. "We'd had a wet spring, but nothing too unusual." For the next hour, as the storm played itself out, they sat in the barn's shadowy interior sharing stories. Thomas told her about the flood, about how the community had come together to help his family recover. Sarah listened intently, asking questions that showed genuine understanding of farming life, though she still deflected most personal questions about her own background. "The rain's letting up," she noted eventually, glancing toward the doors, where thin shafts of sunlight had begun to appear. Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how comfortable their conversation had become. "I should check the roof, see what new leaks we've got to deal with." "Thomas," she said, stopping him as he stood. It was the first time she'd used his first name. "Thank you for sharing that story. I know it couldn't have been easy." He looked back at her, at the way she cradled the old Bible in her lap, at how natural she looked surrounded by the barn's historical treasures. "Sometimes," he said, echoing her words from days before, "the true value of things isn't obvious at first glance." Her smile in response held something more than its usual careful warmth. But before either of them could speak again, a sharp crack from above demanded their attention. They had work to do, and the barn stories would have to wait for another day. The Cedar Grove Diner hadn't changed its breakfast menu in 30 years, and that's exactly how the regulars liked it. Thomas sat in his usual booth, coffee growing cold as he reviewed supply quotes for the barn restoration. The morning crowd, buzzed with their typical chatter until Mabel Henderson swept in, clutching the local paper like it held state secrets. "Did you all see this?" She made her way to the counter, paper held high. "Mystery woman breathes new life into historic Miller. Property! There's a whole article about it." Thomas kept his head down, but his ears pricked up. He'd been dreading this. Small towns had a way of turning speculation into sport. "Says here she bought the place in cash," Mabel continued, clearly enjoying her moment as newsbearer. "No mortgage, no loan. Who does that these days?" "Heard she's from the city," Earl Peters chimed in from his perpetual spot at the counter. "My cousin's boy works at the hardware store. Says she special-ordered some mighty expensive materials for that old barn. Money's no object, apparently." "Well, I heard," Mabel lowered her voice theatrically, "that she's been asking mighty specific questions about local farming history. Betty at the library says she's been going through all the old agricultural records." Thomas gripped his coffee mug tighter, remembering Sarah's architectural drawings, her careful questions about farming traditions. The speculation wasn't wrong, but somehow it felt invasive. "Speaking of that barn," Earl turned toward Thomas's booth, "Mason here's doing the restoration work. What's she like, Thomas? Mysterious, as everyone says?" Before Thomas could formulate a response, the diner's door chimed. Sarah walked in, dressed in her now familiar work clothes, looking perfectly at ease despite the sudden hush that fell over the room. She scanned the diner briefly before spotting Thomas. "Mr. Mason," she said, approaching his booth, "I hoped I'd find you here. Do you have a moment to discuss the timber delivery?" "Of course," he said, grateful for the business-like topic. "Would you like to join me?" The whispers started up again as Sarah slid into the booth. Mabel wasn't even trying to hide her interest, the newspaper still clutched in her hands. "Don't mind the attention," Thomas said quietly. "Small-town curiosity. It'll pass." Sarah's lips curved in a small smile. "Like the time everyone speculated about why the Johnsons painted their barn blue." Thomas blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "I do my research, remember?" She pulled out her notebook. "All business. Now, about that timber. The heritage oak we discussed is available, but there's a complication with the delivery schedule." They spent the next 15 minutes discussing logistics, Sarah displaying her usual detailed knowledge that somehow always stopped just short of revealing its source. The diner's regular crowd gradually returned to their own conversations, though Thomas caught occasional glances their way. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, Mabel finally worked up the courage to approach their booth. "Excuse me, dear, but we're having our annual Harvest Heritage Festival next month. We always love having new faces on the planning committee." "That's very kind," Sarah replied smoothly, "but I'm quite focused on the barn restoration right now. Perhaps another time." Thomas watched her navigate the invitation with gentle firmness, deflecting further questions with practiced ease. It wasn't until they were outside the diner that he saw her shoulders relax slightly. "You handled that well," he observed. "I've had practice." Something flickered across her face. Weariness, maybe, or resignation. "People often want things from me." "The town means well," Thomas found himself saying. "They're just not used to change or mysteries." Sarah turned to him, her expression softening. "And what about you, Mr. Mason? Are you comfortable with mysteries?" "I'm comfortable with people who respect the things I respect," he answered carefully, "who see value in what others might overlook." A genuine smile spread across her face, the kind that reached her eyes and transformed her careful composure. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, more briskly, "I'll see you at the barn later. The timber delivery, I'll handle it," he assured her. "Don't worry about what the paper says. Around here, actions speak louder than words." She nodded once, then headed to a car. Thomas watched her go, aware of faces pressed against the diner's windows. Let them look, he thought. Let them wonder. Some things weren't meant for public consumption. Back inside, he settled his bill as Mabel hovered nearby, clearly burning, with questions. "She seems nice," she ventured finally. "She is," Thomas replied simply, leaving enough tip to ease his earlier reticence. And she's doing right by the Miller barn. That's what matters. He left before Mabel could press further, but he could feel the speculation building behind him, like another storm front moving in. Sarah's presence was stirring up more than just curiosity, he realized. She was making them all question what. They thought they knew about progress, preservation, and the true value of things. "Hold it like this," Thomas demonstrated, his hands wrapped around the worn handle of his father's hand planer. "You want to work with the grain, not against it." The morning sun streamed through the barn's open doors, casting long shadows across the workbench they'd set up. Sarah stood beside him, watching intently as he drew the tool across the reclaimed oak board, creating perfect curled shavings that fell like autumn leaves. The scent of fresh worked wood filled the air, mingling with the familiar mustiness of the old barn. "Why not use the power tools?" she asked, though her tone held curiosity rather than challenge. "Wouldn't it be faster?" Thomas smiled, running his hand over the newly smoothed surface. "Feel this," he invited, stepping back. Sarah's fingers traced the wood, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "It's smoother than the pieces we did yesterday with the electric planer. That's because this way you can read the wood better. Feel how it wants to be worked." He pulled out a small leather-bound book. From his back pocket, its pages yellow with age and soft from handling. "My father's notes. Everything he learned about working with wood, all written down right here." Sarah took the manual reverently, her fingers careful on the delicate pages. "May I?" Thomas nodded, watching as she leafed through the cramped handwriting. Detailed sketches and decades of accumulated wisdom. Her expression reminded him of how she'd looked examining the Miller family Bible, like she was holding something precious. "Your turn," he said, taking the book back and offering her the planer. "Remember, with the grain." Sarah positioned herself as he had, but her grip was too tight, her posture rigid. Thomas stepped closer, adjusting her hands on the tool. "Relax your shoulders," he said softly. "Let the wood guide you." She started the stroke, and the planer chattered across the surface, leaving an uneven path. "Sorry," she muttered, frustration creeping into her voice. "No apologies needed. Try again." He moved to stand behind her, his hands covering hers on the planer's handle. "Feel the rhythm? Like this." Together they guided the tool across the board, creating perfect, gossamer-thin shavings. "I feel it," she said quietly, and Thomas became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the lavender scent of her hair, of how naturally their hands fit together on the old tool. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "Now, try on your own." This time Sarah's stroke was smooth and sure. The shaving curled up perfectly, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I did it. Not bad for a city girl," Thomas teased, then immediately worried he'd overstepped. But Sarah just laughed, the sound echoing in the barn's rafters. "I'll have you know She caught herself, that familiar guard sliding back into place. "I've always enjoyed learning new skills." Thomas pretended not to notice the slip, instead pulling another board from their work pile. "Let's see how you do with this one. It's got some knots that'll test you." They worked through the morning, Sarah proving to be a quick study. She asked intelligent questions about wood grain, tool maintenance, and joinery techniques, sometimes displaying knowledge that seemed at odds with her claimed inexperience. Thomas found himself sharing more than just carpentry skills. He told stories about learning from his father, about restoration projects that had seemed impossible until they weren't, about the satisfaction of bringing old things back to life. "Your father must have been a wonderful teacher," Sarah said during their lunch break, sitting on a hay bale and sharing the sandwiches she'd brought. She was still holding the planer, running her fingers over its worn surfaces as if reading its history. "He was," Thomas agreed, watching her hands on the tool. "Said there were two types of teaching, by telling and by sharing. Telling fills the head, but sharing fills the hands and heart. Is that why you keep his manual?" She nodded toward the book visible in his pocket. "Partly, Thomas pulled it out again, thumbing through the familiar pages. But also because sometimes I need his voice. When I'm stuck on a problem or trying to figure out the right way to do something, I can open this and hear him clear as day, telling me to trust the wood, trust my hands, trust what generations before us learned through trial and error. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You're a lot like him, you know, a natural teacher. Yeah, Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Yeah. She stood up, brushing off her jeans. Now, are you going to teach me about those mortise and tenon joints you mentioned? Or are we going to sit here getting sentimental all day? Thomas laughed, standing to join her. Demanding student, excellent teacher, she countered, then added more softly, Thank you, Thomas, for sharing this with me. He nodded, unable to find the right words to respond to the genuine warmth in her voice. Instead, he picked up his father's chisel set and began explaining the fine art of joint making, while the autumn sun tracked across the barn floor and the old walls creaked their approval of new lessons being learned within their embrace. The Cedar Grove Farmers Market sprawled across the town square, a patchwork of canopies and temporary stalls bright against the October sky. Thomas hadn't planned to come. Saturdays were usually devoted to barn work, but Sarah had insisted. They needed specialized tools that old Jim Crawford sometimes sold at his market stall. You know, Thomas said as they walked between the vendors, we could order these tools online. Sarah shook her head, pausing to examine a display of heritage apples. It's not the same. Besides, she picked up a gnarled russet, turning it in. The morning light. When was the last time you came to market, actually talked to your neighbors? Before Thomas could answer, a voice called out from behind them. Well, if it isn't Thomas Mason, haven't seen you here in an age. Mary Beth Wilson waved from her cheese stall, her white hair escaping from beneath her vendor's cap. Thomas guided Sarah over, noting how Mary Beth's keen eyes took in every detail of their companionship. This must be the mysterious barn owner everyone's talking about, Mary Beth said warmly. Try this, dear. She offered Sarah a sample of aged cheddar, made from our own heritage breed jerseys. Sarah accepted the cheese with practiced grace. The crystallization is beautiful, she observed, examining it before tasting. You're using traditional aging methods? Mary Beth's eyebrows rose. Why? Yes, we cellar age for at least 18 months. Most folks don't notice the difference. The complexity is remarkable, Sarah continued. The paste structure suggests you're working with raw milk. Thomas watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Sarah's knowledge went well beyond that of a casual enthusiast, yet she'd claimed to be new to farming. Thomas! Another voice interrupted his thoughts. Jim Crawford approached, carrying what looked like antique carpentry tools. Heard you were looking for these, found them in my grandfather's workshop. As Thomas examined the tools, he overheard Sarah deep in conversation with Mary Beth about milk protein structures and enzymatic processes. The terminology was technical, specific, the language of someone intimately familiar with artisanal cheese. Production. Your friend knows her dairy, Jim commented quietly, following Thomas's gaze. Saw her earlier at the Peterson booth too, discussing soil chemistry like she had a degree in it. Thomas nodded slowly, adding this new piece to the puzzle that was Sarah Richards. He'd seen a receipt in her car yesterday for high-end farming. Equipment she'd never mentioned ordering. The amount had made his eyes widen. Sarah, he called, perhaps a bit too loudly. Want to check out these tools? She excused herself from Mary Beth and joined them, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the antique implements. These are perfect, she said, reaching for a particularly worn spokeshave. Look at the patina on this handle, years of use by skilled hands. Jim named a price that made Thomas wince, but Sarah was already pulling out her wallet. As she paid, Thomas noticed how she angled herself away from the growing crowd of market-goers, some of whom were watching their interaction with undisguised interest. They made their way through the rest of the market, Sarah stopping occasionally to discuss. crop rotation with vegetable farmers, or livestock breeding with ranchers. Each conversation revealed another layer of expertise that seemed at odds with her supposed background. At the coffee stand, Thomas finally spoke up. "You know an awful lot about farming for someone who's new to all this." Sarah's hands stilled. On her cup. "I read a lot," she said carefully. "Uh-huh." Thomas took a sip of his own coffee. "And that equipment order I saw in your car yesterday. The one worth more than my truck." A slight tension crept into her shoulders. "I believe in having the right tools for the job." "Sarah." He kept his voice gentle. "Who are you, really?" She met his gaze, and for a moment he thought she might actually tell him. Then a group of teenagers pushed past them, phones out, obviously filming. "Look, it's the mystery millionaire lady." Sarah's expression shut down completely. Without a word, she turned and walked quickly toward the parking lot, leaving Thomas holding 2 cooling cups of coffee and a growing sense that things were about to change. He found her by his truck, her composed mask back in place. "I should go," she said. "Thank you for coming to market with me." "Sarah, wait. I'll see you Monday." She cut him off, but not unkindly. "We have those support beams to place, remember?" He watched her walk to her own car, her movements precise and controlled. The antique tools she'd bought sat in a paper bag on his passenger seat, a receipt for an amount that would have once shocked him tucked carefully inside. Driving home, Thomas thought about all the little inconsistencies he'd noticed over the past weeks. Sarah's deep knowledge of agriculture and restoration, her careful avoidance of personal questions, the way she sometimes caught herself before, saying too much, the expensive equipment orders, the rumors of cash purchases and city connections. The mystery was deepening, but so was something else, something that made him worry less about who Sarah Richards really was, and more about how the truth, when it finally came out, would change whatever was growing between them. The photograph caught Thomas's eye as he was clearing space for the new support beam, a simple silver frame, half buried under some old tarps, its glass clouded with dust. He almost missed his next breath when he wiped it clean. There, smiling, up at him, were his parents, standing proud in front of this very barn nearly 20 years ago. "I didn't know your parents worked on the Miller property," Sarah's voice came from behind him. She'd been quieter since the farmer's market 2 days ago, their conversations strictly focused on the restoration work. They didn't exactly. Thomas sat on a nearby beam, his fingers tracing the frame's edge. Dad consulted on some structural issues back when old Miller was still alive. They became friends after that. He smiled faintly. "Mom always said the Millers threw the best harvest parties in the county." Sarah settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Tell me about them." Thomas studied the photo, remembering. Dad was the best barn builder in 3 counties. Could look at a beam and tell you not just its age, but what kind of weather it had weathered. "Mom," his voice softened. "She kept everything running. The farm, the family, the community. When someone needed help, she was there with a casserole and a plan." "What happened?" Sarah asked gently. "Car accident. 6 years ago." Thomas swallowed hard. "Rainy night, bad curve on Route 7. They were coming back from helping the Petersons with their barn raising." He hadn't talked about this in years, but something about Sarah's quiet presence made the words come easier. "I was supposed to be with them that day, but I had equipment problems on the south field." Sarah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining, with his work-roughened ones. "It wasn't your fault. I know that. Most days." He looked down at their joined hands. "But sometimes I wonder if I could have made a difference, if I could have seen the truck coming, or—" "Thomas." She squeezed his hand. "You can't live in what-ifs." Voice of experience. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "My parents," she started, then seemed to choose her words carefully. "I lost them too. Different circumstances, but the empty space they leave behind, it's the same, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, hearing the truth in her voice despite her careful phrasing. "When did it happen?" 3 years ago. Father first, then mother 8 months later. Everyone said it was her heart, but Sarah's free hand clenched slightly. I think she just couldn't imagine a world without him in it. Were you close? Yes and no. A complex emotion crossed her face. They had expectations, plans. I was supposed to follow a certain path, be a certain person. She looked up at the barn's soaring beams. This is the first thing I've done that's truly mine. Not their vision, not their legacy, just mine. A phone buzzed. Hers, and Sarah tensed. She pulled her hand away to silence it without looking at the screen. The moment shifted, reality intruding on their shared vulnerability. We should get back to work, she said, standing. Those support beams won't place themselves. But Thomas caught her arm gently. Sarah, he held up the photo. Thank you for asking about them, for listening. She smiled, that real smile that transformed her whole face. Thank you for sharing them with me. She hesitated, then added, sometimes I think we're all just looking for something solid to hold on to, something real, like an old barn. Like an old barn, she agreed, and the people who understand why it matters. They were standing close now, the photo between them, and Thomas could see flecks of gold in her eyes that he'd never noticed before. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Her phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. Sarah stepped back, the mask of competent professionalism sliding back into place. I should take this, business call. Thomas watched. Her walk away, speaking in low, clipped tones to someone whose name she carefully didn't mention. The photograph in his hand seemed heavier now, weighted with shared confidences and unasked questions. He placed it carefully on a shelf they'd rebuilt together, positioning it so the sunlight caught his parents' smiles. They would have liked. Sarah, he realized, would have seen past her careful facades to the person underneath, the one who understood about legacy and loss, about building something real in a world that too often settled for artificial certainties. When Sarah returned, her phone call clearly having agitated her, though she tried to hide it, Thomas pretended not to notice how she kept checking her messages. Instead, he showed her how to gauge the true level of a beam using just your eye and years of practice, the way his father had taught him. By sunset, her smile had returned, and if there were still secrets between them, there was also something new, a foundation built on shared understanding, as solid as the barn's ancient beams. The magazine lay on Thomas's workbench like an unexploded bomb. Agricultural Innovation Quarterly wasn't his usual reading material, but Earl from the diner had thrust it into his hands with unusual urgency that morning. Now he understood why. There, on the cover, looking polished and professional in a way his Sarah never did, stood Sarah Richards, or rather, as the caption stated, Sarah Richardson Moore, CEO of Ecotech Agricultural Solutions. The article's headline read, "The Billion-Dollar Woman Revolutionizing American Farming." His coffee grew cold as he read about her company's groundbreaking sustainable farming technologies, their massive research facilities, their billions in annual revenue. The Sarah in the article was described as ruthlessly innovative and a driving force in agricultural modernization. The same Sarah who had spent hours learning to plane wood by hand, who understood the value of old things, who held his hand while he talked about his parents. The barn's early morning quiet was shattered by the sound of tires on gravel. Thomas looked up to see Sarah's car pulling in, and for the first time since they'd met, he felt like he was seeing a stranger. She must have read something in his expression because she stopped short in the doorway. Her eyes fell to the magazine, and the color drained from her face. "Thomas, were you ever going to tell me?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Or was I just part of your, what did they call it? Hands-on research into traditional farming methods?" "It's not like that." Sarah took a step forward, then stopped when he straightened from his workbench. "Yes, I'm the CEO of Ecotech, but everything else, the barn, our work together, it's all real." "Real?" Thomas picked up the magazine. "Like how you're revolutionizing farming, helping big corporations squeeze out family farms like mine." "If you'd read the whole article, I read enough." He tossed the magazine back on the bench. "Your company's been buying up failed farms all over the Midwest, turning them into automated agricultural centers. That's what the Henderson's place is going to become, isn't it? Another one of your modern marvels?" Sarah flinched. "I didn't know about the Henderson acquisition. Our regional managers handle—" "Don't," Thomas cut her off. "Just don't." He walked to the barn door, needing space, air, perspective. The autumn morning that had seemed so promising minutes ago now felt bitter with betrayal. "Thomas, please." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Let me explain." He turned back to her, saw the desperate sincerity in her eyes. But before either of them could speak again, the sound of more vehicles approaching cut through the tension. 3 news vans were making their way up the drive, followed by a string of cars. Word had gotten out. "I have to go." Sarah's professional mask slammed back into place, but Thomas caught the flash of panic in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I never meant. This wasn't supposed to happen like this." She was gone before he could respond, her car kicking up dust as she fled. Thomas watched the media circus approach, their cameras already rolling, questions already being shouted. Inside the barn, the magazine mocked him from the workbench, its glossy pages reflecting the morning sun, like a mirror showing him all the things he should have seen. Later, after he'd given the reporters nothing but no comment and locked up the barn, he found himself at his kitchen table, staring at his father's old ledger, the same ledger Sarah had looked at with such understanding, offering suggestions about crop rotation and sustainable practices that now made perfect sense. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from neighbors, questions from reporters, even an interview request from a national farming magazine. Everyone wanted to know about the billionaire CEO who'd been playing at being a simple barn owner in their small town. But all Thomas could think about was the way Sarah's hands had trembled when she held his parents' photograph. The genuine joy in her eyes when she'd successfully planned her first board. The quiet vulnerability when she talked about her own parents' expectations. The truth about Sarah Richardson Moore was now splashed across every local news outlet and social media. In platform, but Thomas wasn't sure anyone, including himself, knew the whole story. The corporate buyout contract sat unopened on Thomas's kitchen table, its crisp white envelope stark against the worn wood. "Third one this month." The offers kept getting higher, more insistent, as if they could smell desperation on the autumn wind. A week had passed since Sarah's identity had been revealed. The barn stood silent, tools laying exactly where they'd been left that morning. Thomas had thrown himself into his own farm work, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of physical labor, but every task reminded him of her, the way she'd asked. About his planting schedule, her keen interest in his sustainable practices, her quick grasp of traditional farming techniques. The evening news droned from his small TV. Ecotech Agricultural Solutions announced today a major initiative to preserve traditional farming practices through technological innovation. CEO Sarah Richardson Moore spoke at the company's headquarters. Thomas reached for the remote, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Our goal isn't to replace traditional farming wisdom," she was saying, looking polished and professional, yet somehow tired around the eyes. "It's to support and enhance it. We're launching a grant program for family farms, focusing on those who maintain sustainable, traditional practices while incorporating selective modern innovations." The camera cut to footage of protest signs outside Ecotech's headquarters. "Save family farms and stop corporate takeovers." Sarah's voice continued over the images. "We understand the concerns. Change is frightening, but we're not here to destroy the old ways. We're here to help preserve them." Thomas switched off the TV, but her words lingered. He'd been getting strange calls lately. From the bank, from the equipment supplier, from the seed company. Apparently his outstanding balances had been reviewed and adjusted. No one could tell him why or how. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Eddie Thompson, his nearest neighbor, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes. "Thomas," Eddie twisted his hat in his hands. "Need to talk to you about something strange. Been happening to a few of us around here." Thomas waved him to a chair. "Coffee? No, this won't take long." Eddie pulled out a letter. "Got this yesterday. Anonymous donors offering to fund a cooperative equipment sharing program. High-end stuff, but with maintenance costs covered. Thing is, they want you to manage it." Thomas stared at the letter. The proposal was detailed, professional, and exactly what the local farmers had been talking about needing for years. "There's more," Eddie continued. "Jenkins, over in Mill Creek. Someone bought his mortgage, restructured it so he could keep his place. Mary Beth's got a mysterious investor interested in expanding her cheese production, and now this equipment co-op." He gave Thomas a meaningful look. "People are talking. People are always talking," Thomas said roughly. "True, but they're saying your lady friend, she's not my anything. Your former client, then. They're saying she's behind it, using her company's resources to help but keeping it quiet-like." Thomas picked up the contract from his table, the one offering to buy his farm. The letterhead wasn't Ecotech's. "Not everything's about Sarah Richardson Moore." Eddie stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Maybe not, but you might want to read the fine print on that proposal. Sounds an awful lot like something someone with first-hand knowledge of local farming would put together." He headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and Thomas, somebody donated a bunch of historical farming equipment to the museum. Really valuable stuff, including some mighty fine horse tack." After Eddie left, Thomas unfolded the equipment cooperative proposal. The language was formal, corporate, but the underlying ideas were familiar: supporting traditional methods, preserving local farming knowledge, building community resilience. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The barn misses you." Thomas stared at the message for a long time. Through his window, he could see the Miller barn in the distance, its newly repaired roof solid against the darkening sky. In his mind, he heard Sarah's voice from weeks ago. Sometimes the true value of things isn't obvious at first glance. He picked up the cooperative proposal again, reading more carefully this time. Between the lines of legal language and technical specifications, he could see a vision of farming that bridged two worlds, one that honored tradition while embracing necessary change, one that understood the value of both roots and branches. The autumn wind whispered through his apple trees, carrying the first hint of winter. Soon it would be too cold to work on the barn, but maybe he thought there were other things that needed building first. The attic had always been his mother's domain. Even now, years after her passing, Thomas felt like an intruder as he pushed aside boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. He was looking for his father's old equipment manuals, but what he found instead stopped him cold: a ribbon-bound bundle of letters, the paper yellowed with age. "My dearest Elizabeth," he read, recognizing his father's strong handwriting. "Times are hard, and the bank's breathing down our necks, but don't worry. I've got a plan that might just save everything." Thomas settled onto an old chair. Dust, motes dancing in the beam of his flashlight as he began to read. The letters spanned decades, chronicling his parents' journey through the hardest years of their marriage. Financial struggles, droughts, the constant pressure to sell the farm. It was all there, along with something else that made his throat tight: unwavering faith in each other. "I know you're worried about taking the loan," his mother had written back. "People say we're foolish to stick with the old ways when modern methods promise better yields. But you've always seen value where others see only cost. Trust that. Trust us." Another letter caught his eye, this one from his father during the devastating drought of '89. The corporate buyers came again today. Their offer was higher this time, said we're standing in the way of progress. Maybe we are, but progress without preservation isn't progress at all. It's just change for change's sake. You understand that better than anyone. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he read on. The parallels were impossible to ignore. His parents had faced the same pressures he was facing now, the same choice between tradition and survival. And Sarah, wasn't she trying to bridge that gap in her own way? He found a letter from just months before the accident, his mother's handwriting less steady, but her words sure. "Remember when everyone said we were crazy to restore the old Thompson barn? Said it would cost more than building new? But you saw what others couldn't, that some things carry value beyond their price tag. That's always been your gift, John, seeing the worth in what others would throw away." A creaking floorboard startled him. Mary Beth Wilson stood in the attic doorway, holding a covered dish. "Thought you might need some dinner," she said, then noticed the letters. "Oh, you found them. You knew about these?" Mary Beth settled onto a nearby trunk. "Your mother showed them to me once, when I was thinking of selling my dairy herd. Said they helped her remember that the hardest choices aren't always about money." "Did you know," Thomas asked suddenly, "about what Sarah's been doing for the community? The equipment co-op, the mysterious mortgage help?" Mary Beth smiled. "Word gets around. Question is, why do you think she's keeping it quiet?" Thomas looked down at the letters in his hands. "Because she wants the help to be accepted on its own merits, not because it came from a billionaire CEO. Sounds like someone else I knew," Mary Beth said softly. "Your father never wanted credit for helping neighbors. Said good work speaks for itself." She stood, patting his shoulder. "That casserole needs heating. And Thomas, I saw lights on at the barn last night, late, and a certain CEO's car in the drive." After Mary Beth left, Thomas read through the letters once more. His father's voice seemed to speak directly to him. "Sometimes pride gets in the way of seeing clearly. The trick is figuring out which kind of pride to keep and which to let go of." The autumn night had grown cold, but the barn's light still glowed in the distance. Thomas gathered the letters carefully, tucking them into his jacket pocket. Their weight felt like guidance, like permission, like understanding. His phone still held that last text. "The barn misses you." Looking at it now, he could see what he'd missed before. Not just the words, but the vulnerability behind them. Sarah hadn't needed to restore an old barn. She certainly hadn't needed to do it by hand, or learn traditional methods, or spend hours listening to local farming stories. She'd chosen to, just as she was choosing now, to help the community in ways that preserved their dignity, along with their farms. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching rain. The barn's lights glowed steadily, like a beacon, like an invitation, like a reminder that some things, trust, understanding, forgiveness, had to be built as carefully as century-old barns, one piece at a time. The community hall was packed, every folding chair filled with worried faces. Thomas stood at the back, watching Midwest Agricultural Enterprises' slick corporate presentation about their vision for Cedar Grove's future. The speaker's words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear: sell now or struggle alone. Their infrastructure investment will modernize the entire region, the presenter said smoothly. Those who join us early will receive premium offers. The hall's double doors swung open. Sarah stood in the doorway, not in corporate attire, but in her work clothes, complete with dust from the barn. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "but I believe there are some details missing from this presentation." The MEA presenter faltered. "Ms. Richardson Moore, we weren't expecting—" Clearly not. Sarah moved down the center aisle, nodding to familiar faces. She stopped next to Thomas, their shoulders almost touching. "May I?" Without waiting for an answer, she turned to address the crowd. "I've spent the last 2 months working alongside you, learning your methods, understanding your challenges. And yes, I run a large agricultural corporation, but I've also seen firsthand what makes Cedar Grove special." She pulled a document from her back pocket, a petition, Thomas realized, recognizing signatures he'd gathered himself. "Your community has submitted a proposal for historical agricultural district designation. If approved, it would protect traditional farming practices while allowing for selective modernization. My company is prepared to support this initiative. The MEA presenter stepped forward. Ms. Richardson-Moore, this is highly irregular, is trying to pressure family farms into selling before they learn about pending preservation legislation, Sarah countered. She turned back to the crowd. You don't have to choose between tradition and survival. There's a third option, one that preserves what matters while building for the future. Thomas found himself moving forward. She's right. All eyes turned to him, but he focused on the faces he'd known all his life. I've seen her plans. They're not about replacing us. They're about supporting what we already do. Traditional methods, modern support, the best of both worlds. The meeting erupted into discussion. Farmers gathered in clusters, examining Sarah's documents, asking questions. The MEA presenter tried to regain control, but the mood had shifted. Later, as the hall emptied, Thomas and Sarah stood in the parking lot under a sky scattered with stars. That was quite an entrance, he said finally. I've always had a flair for dramatic timing. She smiled, then grew serious. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, about being a CEO, about everything. Why I came here, what I was hoping to build. She turned to face him fully. I spent years watching traditional farming communities get swallowed up by corporations like MEA, watching knowledge that took generations to gain just disappear. I wanted to find a different way, but I needed to understand it from the inside, not just from spreadsheets and reports. So you bought a barn. I bought a barn, she agreed, and found something I wasn't expecting. Her voice softened. Someone who taught me that the true value of tradition isn't in preserving the past exactly as it was, but in building a future that honors what matters most. Thomas reached for her hand, feeling the calluses she'd earned working alongside him. We still have a barn to finish. Is that an invitation? More like a promise. He looked toward the Miller barn, its silhouette strong against the night sky. My father used to say that anything worth building takes time, trust, and truth. We've got the time. I'm working on the trust. And now we've got the truth too. Sarah squeezed his hand. There's more work to do. MEA won't give up easily. Good thing we're used to hard work. Thomas smiled. Partners? Partners, she agreed, and in that word he heard everything they weren't yet saying, about the barn, about the community, about themselves. They stood, together under the stars, their joined hands a bridge between worlds, while around them the night wind carried the scent of autumn earth and new possibilities. The Miller barn's main floor had become their war room. Blueprint paper covered the old workbench, weighted down with tools and coffee cups. Sarah stood at one end, her tablet propped against a beam, while Thomas traced his finger along a map of local farmland. The key is connecting these properties, he said, indicating the patchwork of family farms. If we can show how traditional methods actually improve soil quality over time, we can justify the historical designation. Sarah nodded, making notes. My research team's data supports it. Farms using traditional rotation methods show significantly better soil composition than industrial operations. Thomas watched her work, still amazed by how seamlessly she moved between worlds, equally comfortable discussing soil chemistry and hand-planing wood. The blueprint between them outlined their vision, a farming cooperative that would preserve individual ownership while sharing advanced equipment and resources. Look at this, Sarah said, pulling up a document on her tablet. I've drafted a structure for the cooperative. Each farm maintains autonomy, but gains access to modern equipment, shared processing facilities and direct market connections. She hesitated. And Ecotech provides initial funding and technological support, but with no ownership stake. Just partnership. Thomas studied the proposal. It was elegantly designed, protecting both independence and innovation. You've done this before? No, she met his eyes. Cedar Grove is the prototype. If it works here, she gestured at the barn around them, This isn't just about saving a few farms, Thomas. It's about creating a model that could work anywhere. A knock at the barn door interrupted them. Mary Beth Wilson entered, followed by several other local farmers. They'd been meeting like this regularly since the community hall confrontation, building support for their alternative to MEA's buyout plan. "Brought reinforcements," Mary Beth announced, setting down a basket of her famous cheese scones. "And some news. MEA's representatives are making house calls again. Pressure's mounting. Eddie." Thompson unfolded a fresh petition. "Got 30 more signatures supporting the historical designation. People are starting to believe it could work." As the group gathered around the workbench, Thomas watched Sarah naturally shift into teacher mode, explaining complex agricultural policies in simple terms, then listening intently as farmers shared generations of local knowledge. This was her gift, not just understanding both worlds, but helping them understand each other. "The cooperative structure protects individual land ownership," she explained, pointing to key sections of the blueprint, "while the historical designation preserves traditional methods. But we're not rejecting all modern innovations. We're selecting the ones that enhance what you already do well." "Like that soil monitoring system you mentioned?" Eddie asked. "The one that uses traditional wisdom about planting times but adds precision technology?" "Exactly," Sarah smiled. "Innovation shouldn't replace experience. It should support it." The meeting continued as afternoon sun slanted through the barn's restored walls. Farmers who'd once viewed Sarah with suspicion now sought her advice, while she in turn absorbed their multi-generational wisdom with genuine respect. After the others left, Thomas and Sarah stood looking at their blueprint in the fading light. Her shoulder brushed his as she reached to adjust a detail in the plans. "You know," he said quietly, "when you first showed up here, I thought you were just another city person playing at farming." She laughed softly. "I was terrified you'd see, right through me. I did. Just not in the way I expected." He turned to face her. "You didn't just learn about farming here, did you? You found something you were looking for." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the blueprint. "My whole life I've moved in circles where everything's about the bottom line, efficiency, progress at any cost." She looked around the barn, at the careful restoration they'd done together. "Here, I found people who measure value differently, who understand that some things are worth preserving, worth doing the slow, hard way. And now you're building a bridge between those worlds." "We are," she corrected, smiling. "Partner." The blueprint between them caught the last rays of sunlight, their vision made tangible in ink and paper. Outside, Cedar Grove's fields stretched toward the horizon, waiting for a future that would honor both their past and their potential. The foreclosure notice felt heavy in Thomas's hands, its bold red letters stark against the white paper. Final notice. Payment due within 48 hours. The bank had moved up their timeline, no doubt pressured by MEA's aggressive expansion plans. His family's farm, 4 generations of work, memories and dreams, could be gone in 2 days. He sat at his kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, loan documents, tax assessments, equipment liens. The numbers hadn't gotten any better no matter how many times he'd recalculated them. Even with the recent mysterious adjustments to some of his debts, the total needed was far beyond his reach. A knock at the door startled him. Sarah stood on his porch, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression he'd never seen before. Something between determination and fear. "Mary Beth called me," she said without preamble. "Told me about the notice." Thomas stepped back to let her in, watching as she took in the papers scattered across his table. She picked up the foreclosure notice, her lips tightening as she read. "I can help," she said quietly. "One phone call?" "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. "Thomas, be reasonable. This isn't just about pride anymore. This farm isn't just your heritage, it's essential to our cooperative plan. Without your land as the central hub," I said no. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I can't be the farmer who saved his land by taking handouts from his rich girlfriend." The word hung between them. Girlfriend. they hadn't defined. What they were to each other, too focused on saving the community to address their growing personal connection. Sarah set down the notice and opened her manila envelope. Then don't think of it that way. Think of it as an investment in our shared vision. She spread out a new set of documents, incorporation papers for the Cedar Grove Agricultural Cooperative. Your farm would be the demonstration site for integrating traditional methods with sustainable innovation. A teaching center for other communities facing similar challenges. Sarah, just listen. Her voice took on the same passion she'd shown in the barn while learning traditional craftsmanship. Your knowledge, your connection to this land, that's not charity, Thomas. It's an asset, one that other communities desperately need. He looked at the incorporation papers, seeing his name listed as Master Farmer and Traditional Methods Director. Seeing his farm designated as the Center for Agricultural Heritage and Innovation. The money wouldn't come from me, Sarah continued softly. It would come from the cooperative's educational grant funding. Everything legitimate, everything transparent. Thomas sank into a chair, the weight of generations of Mason pride pressing down on him. My father would want the farm to survive. Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. Remember what you told me, he used to say, about farming time itself. This is your chance to do that on a larger scale, to ensure that what you know, what generations of farmers know, isn't lost. Her fingers intertwined with his, and he remembered how these same hands had learned to work wood, to feel the grain, to understand that some things couldn't be rushed or bought, only earned through patience and care. I'm not offering charity, she said. I'm offering partnership in everything. The last words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with meaning. Thomas looked around his kitchen, at the curtains his mother had sewn, the table where his father had taught him to read weather patterns in farming almanacs, the window where he'd watched seasons change across fields his family had worked for generations. If we do this, he said slowly, it has to be real. No corporate shortcuts, no compromising what this place stands for. Sarah's face lit up with that genuine smile he'd first seen in the barn. That's exactly what the sound of vehicles on the gravel drive cut her off. Through the window, they could see 3 MEA cars approaching, their corporate logos gleaming in the morning sun. Sarah stood, straightening her shoulders. Ready to fight for our future, partner? Thomas rose beside her, the incorporation papers, in his hand feeling not like surrender, but like a new kind of victory. Together, outside, the MEA representatives were already walking toward the house, their briefcases no doubt full of final buyout offers, but inside, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sarah, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since finding that foreclosure notice: hope. The partnership agreement lay on the broad wooden table in the Miller barn, its fresh ink gleaming in the afternoon light. Around it sat the core members of the newly formed Cedar Grove Agricultural Cooperative. Mary Beth with her dairy expertise, Eddie Thompson representing the grain farmers, 3 other local farmers, Thomas and Sarah. The document represented months of work, legal consultations, and careful compromising, a bridge between tradition and progress. Just need your signature. Thomas, Sarah said softly. Then we can move forward with the historical designation and grant applications. Thomas picked up the pen, its weight somehow greater than the countless tools he'd handled in this same barn. One signature would change everything, not just for his farm, but for the entire community. Before I sign, he said, looking around the table at faces he'd known all his life and at Sarah's face that had become as familiar as his own reflection, I want to make sure everyone understands what we're agreeing to. This isn't just about saving our farms. It's about building something new while protecting what matters most. Mary Beth reached over and squeezed his hand. We understand, Thomas, and we trust both of you. The words both of you hung in the air, acknowledging what everyone had come to see, that Thomas and Sarah's partnership had grown far beyond business. Their shared vision had become something deeper, more personal. Thomas signed his name with steady strokes. Sarah followed, not with her corporate signature, but with the one he'd seen her use on barn receipts and supply orders. Her real signature, the one that belonged to the woman who'd learned to plane wood by hand and understand the soul of a barn. "Well then," Eddie said, standing with a grin, "reckon we should let you two finish up here. Got a feeling there's some things need saying without an audience." The others filed out, their excited chatter about future plans fading into the autumn. Afternoon. Thomas and Sarah stood together in the barn they'd restored, surrounded by the tools they'd used and the history they'd preserved. "I have something for you," Sarah said, reaching into her workbag. She pulled out a worn leather journal, his father's manual that she'd borrowed weeks ago. "I had some copies made for the teaching center, but this one—" She ran her fingers over the worn cover. "This one belongs here, with you." Thomas took the manual, feeling its familiar weight. "You know, when you first came here, I thought you were running away from something." "I was," she admitted. "From expectations, from a world that only valued the bottom line." She moved closer, her hand finding his. "Instead, I found something to run toward." We both did. Thomas set the manual down next to the partnership agreement. 2 documents, one old, one new, both charting paths forward. "The MEA representatives will be back," Sarah said. "They won't give up easily." "Let them come." Thomas smiled. "We've got something they don't understand, something they can't buy." "And what's that?" Instead of answering, Thomas pulled her closer. Here in the barn where they'd first met, where they'd learned to trust each other's hands and hearts, he finally kissed her. Sarah responded immediately, her fingers curling into his shirt, her body fitting against his as naturally as aged wood, settling into place. When they parted, the late afternoon sun was streaming through the restored walls, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, they could hear the sounds of their community, tractors in distant fields, children's laughter from the Thompson place, the general rhythm of rural life continuing as it had for generations. "Partner," Sarah whispered against his chest. "In everything," Thomas agreed, holding her close. The partnership agreement waited on the table, no longer just a business document, but a testament to possibility, to the idea that love, like farming, was about nurturing growth while honoring roots, that sometimes the greatest leaps of faith were the ones that carried you home. The newspaper article was everything they hadn't wanted, splashed across the front page of the Cedar Grove Gazette, complete with photos of the barn, the cooperative signing, and Sarah and Thomas standing together. Local farmer and tech billionaire. Unite to save rural heritage. "Well," Sarah said, setting the paper down on the barn's workbench, "so much for keeping things quiet." But Thomas was studying the article with unexpected interest. "Look at how they wrote it, though." He pointed to the subtitle, "Cedar Grove, Agricultural Cooperative Pioneers' New Model for Sustainable Farming." The story focused not on their personal relationship or Sarah's wealth, but on the innovative partnership they'd created. The reporter had interviewed Mary Beth about the dairy program, Eddie about the equipment sharing initiative, and other farmers about the teaching center plans. There were quotes from agricultural experts praising the model's potential for nationwide implementation. A knock at the barn door interrupted their reading. "Time to face the music," Sarah murmured, but her worry faded when she saw who it was. Jim. Crawford stood there holding his grandfather's old ledger. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, opening the worn book. "Found it when we were clearing out the attic. Records of how farms used to work together back in the day, sharing equipment, trading labor, supporting each other through hard times." He smiled. "Sound familiar?" More visitors arrived throughout the morning, farmers bringing old photos, documents, and stories. Each piece added to the larger picture they were creating, a bridge between past and future. Mary Beth brought her grandmother's recipe book, filled with notes about community harvest celebrations. "Speaking of which," she said with a meaningful, "look at the renovated barn. This place looks about ready for a proper gathering. The idea spread through the community like wildfire. By afternoon, the barn was transforming. Women arrived with quilts to hang on the walls, each one telling a story of Cedar Grove's history. Men brought hay bales and tables, setting them up just as their grandparents had done for harvest celebrations decades ago. Sarah watched it all with wonder. "I never expected this," she whispered to Thomas. "When I came here, I thought I was just saving a barn. Instead, you helped save a way of life," he replied, squeezing her hand. "By remembering it's not just about the past or the future, it's about bringing them together." The celebration that evening drew people from 3 counties. The barn glowed with string lights, its restored beams witness to a new chapter in its long history. Farmers who'd once viewed Sarah with suspicion now sought her out, sharing ideas for the teaching center. Young couples eagerly signed up for traditional farming classes, while their grandparents volunteered to teach them. The local press had been invited, but they weren't the only ones there. National agricultural magazines sent reporters, drawn by the unique story of tradition meeting innovation. Sarah handled the media with practiced grace, always directing attention back to the community, to the cooperative, to the future they were building together. "And what about your relationship with Mr. Mason?" one reporter asked, notepad ready. Sarah looked across the barn at Thomas, who was showing a group of children how to use a hand planer. "Some things," she said softly, "are built to last. Like this barn, like this community, like the understanding that real value isn't about money. It's about what you choose to preserve, what you choose to build, and who you choose to build it with." As the evening wound down, Thomas and Sarah stood in the barn doorway, watching their 2 worlds mingle and merge in the golden light. The old building seemed to hold its own memories while embracing new ones, the past and future finding harmony in its sturdy walls. "Think we did it?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. "Did what?" "Found a way to save everything that matters." Thomas pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender mixed with wood shavings. "I think we did something." "Better," he said. "We found a way to help it grow." The wedding invitation was elegant in its simplicity, cream-colored paper with an embossed image of the Miller barn. Inside, the words told their story without saying it outright. "In the place where tradition meets tomorrow, Sarah Richardson Moore and Thomas Mason invite you to celebrate their marriage." Thomas held the sample invitation up to the barn's morning light, remembering that first day when Sarah had appeared on his doorstep. The barn's restoration was complete now, its renewed strength a testament to everything they'd built together. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, coming up behind him. She'd just finished a video call with the first group of farming apprentices, young people from across the country, eager to learn traditional methods. "It's perfect," he said, turning to face her, "just like the place we chose." The barn had become more than they'd imagined, not just a historical structure or a working building, but a symbol of possibility. The teaching center was thriving, with a waiting list of farmers wanting to learn their integrated approach. The cooperative had already been replicated in 2 other communities, with more in talks to follow the Cedar Grove model. "Did you see the latest figures?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, showing him the soil quality reports from farms using their combined methods. Traditional rotation patterns supported by modern monitoring. "The results are better than either approach alone." Thomas smiled, remembering how she'd once tried to hide her expertise. Now they moved seamlessly between worlds, her corporate knowledge enhancing his traditional wisdom, his practical experience grounding her innovations. Me-A had finally backed off their aggressive expansion plans, thwarted by the historical designation and the cooperative's success. More importantly, their own board had started asking questions about the Cedar Grove model, wondering if they'd missed something important. About the value of tradition. A truck pulled up outside, Eddie Thompson with the last load of hay for the wedding. The barn would be arranged just as it had been in those old photos they'd found months ago, blending past and present in a way that felt exactly right. "Almost time," Sarah said, sliding her hand into his. The morning sun caught the simple engagement. Ring she wore, a band of polished wood with a small diamond crafted by Thomas himself. "Having second thoughts about a barn wedding," he teased. "Could still do that fancy hotel your board suggested." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing in the rafters. "They'd restored together. You know better than that. This barn." She looked around at the soaring beams, the weathered wood that held generations of stories. "This is where we found each other, where we learned that the strongest things are built from both old and new." The sound of more vehicles approaching drew them to the door. Mary Beth's truck led a line of cars, the wedding preparation committee arriving with quilts, flowers, and enough food to feed half the county. "You ready for this?" Thomas asked, watching their community come together one more time. Sarah squeezed his hand. "I was ready the day you taught me to plane wood. I just didn't know it yet." They stepped out into the autumn morning, greeting their neighbors, no, their partners in this grand experiment of bridging worlds. The barn stood proud behind them, its restored strength a promise kept, a future secured, a love story written in wood and work, and the wisdom of knowing what truly matters tomorrow. They would stand before their families and friends, joining their lives officially. But in all the ways that counted most, they'd already built something lasting. A foundation as solid as the barn's ancient beams, as innovative as their shared vision, as real as the love that had grown between them, while restoring not just a building, but a way of life. Thomas pulled Sarah close, breathing in the familiar mix of lavender and wood shavings that had become his favorite scent. Around them, the community buzzed with preparation, the future hummed with possibility, and the past stood guard in the sturdy walls that had brought them together. Some things, they had learned, were built to last, like barns, like communities, like love that grows from honest work and shared purpose, like the understanding that the best foundations are built from both what we save and what we dare to build new. And in Cedar Grove, where tradition and progress had found a way to dance together, a restored barn stood ready to witness one more. Beginning, not an ending at all, but the start of their greatest restoration project yet, a shared life, built beam by beam, day by day with patience and purpose and love.